You were never going to get a dime from Dad's estate, and everyone here knows it." My brother sneered, leaning back in the polished leather chair at the law firm, the sound of his laughter bouncing off the marble walls like a cold echo in an empty theater. And for a second, the room went still. The silence so thick I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the subtle clink of the secretary's pen tapping on her desk, and the murmurs of my parents' friends hovering awkwardly in the corner, pretending not to watch me crumble under the weight of that simple, brutal sentence. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name's Ethan Porter. I'm 38 years old, and I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, a city that smells like cornfields in the spring and cheap diner coffee in the winter, where everyone knows everyone else's business, and if they don't, they pretend they do. I've spent the better part of my adult life building a life that balanced precariously on ambition, loyalty, and the relentless grind of modern American adulthood, juggling office deadlines that never end, the gnawing pressure of student loans, and the kind of family responsibilities that make you question whether you're living for yourself or just for everyone else's illusion of you. I felt my palms sweat as I clenched the small brass keychain in my pocket, the one my father had given me when I turned 16, a tiny token shaped like a classic 1965 Mustang, meaningless to most, but for me, a symbol of trust, hard work, and family history. And I had learned over the years that such sentimental trinkets often became the subtle anchors of both pride and pain. My brother didn't see it, of course. He saw only opportunity, greed glinting in his eyes, a twin to the resentment I never knew he harbored beneath the facade of shared childhood memories. And yet I had a secret advantage, a detail so small it seemed invisible, something he could never anticipate, not even in his wildest schemes, and it made me calm, oddly calm, despite the public shaming, because I knew that life had a way of balancing scales in ways you couldn't script. I tried to laugh it off, an ironic, humorless chuckle that sounded more like a cough, because my father's lawyer had asked me to sit before they discussed the will in detail, and the room smelled like expensive coffee and leather polish, a mix that somehow made the humiliation sharper, more surreal. "You always think if you work hard, it'll be enough," I muttered under my breath, not to anyone in particular, but to the invisible audience of my own conscience. But life has a way of proving you wrong when you least expect it. And sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones sharpening knives behind your back. The truth was, I had carried the weight of our family finances for over a decade, quietly paying off mortgages, covering college tuition, and making sure that my brother had a lifestyle that would make our parents proud. A responsibility I took seriously because, in my mind, family was supposed to be sacred, a collective endeavor rather than a ledger of who owed what, but apparently to him, it had always been a zero-sum game. A competition to see who could walk away with the spoils. I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks, a cocktail of anger, embarrassment, and disbelief, yet there was a rhythm to my thoughts, a cadence that kept me tethered. Coffee in the morning, emails answered by 9, workouts at the gym to remind myself that I was alive and capable, and a recurring mantra that had carried me through every betrayal and setback. People forget, deadlines don't. Loyalty is earned, but resentment is inherited. The symbolic keychain, warm against my palm, reminded me that no matter what he had done, there was a history, a lineage, a sequence of decisions and documents and contracts that still belonged to me in ways he couldn't touch yet. My parents, caught between embarrassment and awkwardness, exchanged glances that said more than words ever could, and my mother's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup, the porcelain clinking against the saucer like a tiny bell of caution. I remembered long drives to Des Moines outskirts, the Mustang keys swinging in my hand as Dad explained, in his gravelly voice, how responsibility wasn't about who earned more but who bore the consequences when everything went wrong, lessons I had internalized but that my brother, apparently, had skipped over. I forced myself to breathe, slow, deliberate, in and out, the air heavy with a mixture of fear and resolve, reminding myself that public humiliation was just a scene, a temporary spotlight, and not the whole story. "You always think the house will mean something to you, Ethan," he continued, voice dripping with mockery. "But Dad made it clear. It's mine now, all mine." Laughter erupted from a couple of junior lawyers in the room who probably found the spectacle entertaining, a display of wealth and family drama that would fuel gossip for months. And in that laughter, I felt the smallest spark of resolve, A flicker of clarity that cut through the shame. He thought he'd won, but he had only opened the window. As I glanced at the documents on the table, legal papers that outlined the transfer of assets, I felt a strange detachment, a cinematic awareness of myself as both participant and observer in a story that was unfolding faster than my emotions could catch up. I thought of the mundane things that had defined my life. The scent of coffee brewing at 6:30 a.m., the familiar squeak of the gym floor under my running shoes, the rhythm of the freeway during solo drives with a playlist of old rock songs. These anchors of normalcy that made me human and gave me perspective when betrayal felt like a tidal wave. I remembered telling myself, more times than I could count, you can forgive, you can endure, but you can never allow someone to redefine your worth without your consent. A line of grit-forged philosophy that had carried me through layoffs, broken friendships, and failed ventures, and it resonated now louder than my brother's taunts. I sat back in the leather chair, fingers lightly brushing the Mustang keychain, tracing its curves like a tactile map to clarity, and began a mental inventory. Emails sent to Dad years ago detailing repairs, receipts for renovations I had paid for in secret, bank transfers covering mortgage gaps, every transaction a thread in the tapestry of evidence that could unravel his smug certainty if I played my hand correctly. The air smelled faintly of vanilla coffee, a comforting scent amidst chaos, and I realized that humor might be my last shield. Guess the Mustang key is worth more than I thought, I muttered under my breath, a wry smile forming despite the knot in my stomach, imagining his reaction if he knew that the tiny brass key wasn't just sentimental, it was a breadcrumb, a link to a hidden record of transactions, agreements, and oversight that he had never considered. The lawyer began to speak, the words legal, procedural, heavy, but I barely heard them. My mind was already running through scenarios, countermeasures, the delicate art of leveraging overlooked details, tiny mistakes, and bureaucratic technicalities that could shift the entire narrative in a single stroke. I thought of my childhood room, posters peeling off the wall, trophies gathering dust, and how my brother had always sneered at my attempts to hold on to memories while he sought only status, a symbolic contrast that now mirrored the inheritance itself. History versus bravado, effort versus entitlement. My jaw tightened, a knot of anger and focus as I rehearsed lines I might never speak aloud but that fueled an internal fire. Jealousy is the silent tax of those who envy hard work. Arrogance is a currency spent foolishly on people who don't care. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had carried the family through decades of stability, while he had mastered the art of public performance, a facade of competence masking decades of passivity and resentment. In that tension, I felt the subtle thrill of strategy, the seed of suspense that only I knew, a small advantage planted deep within the shadows of paperwork, a fact that would only reveal itself at the perfect moment. My eyes flicked to the coffee cup in front of me, the last sip cooling in the ceramic, and I realized that every betrayal, every sneer, every cruel word was a piece of narrative I could wield like a blade, precise and silent, in a game he thought he controlled. And so I sat there, in the grand room, among the clinking of coffee cups and the murmurs of bystanders, fingers tracing a Mustang key, a man outwardly humiliated but inwardly plotting, aware that this was only the opening act of a story that would bend, twist, and ultimately expose the fragile scaffolding of greed, entitlement, and sibling rivalry, and I whispered again to myself, softly but firmly, you can't rewrite the past, but you can engineer the undoing of those who think they've stolen the future. The room felt heavier after my brother's words, like the air had thickened into a substance I could almost taste. Bitter, metallic, the kind of suffocating tension that sticks to your throat after a fight you never asked for, but somehow inherited anyway, and as I sat there, gripping the Mustang keychain so tightly it pressed cold into my palm, I tried to recall any memory that might anchor me. A fragment of normal life amidst the chaos. Saturday mornings at the old diner with Dad, him grumbling about my oatmeal while I nursed a too-sweet coffee, the smell of syrup and burnt toast curling around us like some ritual of family survival, a tradition so small it seemed almost ridiculous. But now, in this lawyer's office, it felt like a lifeline to a version of my family that hadn't turned predatory overnight. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I am Ethan Porter, 38, born and bred in Des Moines, Iowa, and I have spent the last 20 years trying to make sense of what it means to be responsible for more than just yourself. and suddenly realizing that responsibility can be weaponized against you by those who smile at you over breakfast, who nod and say, "I trust you," while they sharpen knives in the shadows. And this, I realized, was exactly what my brother had done. He had cultivated charm, memorized the right words, and hidden the simmering resentment beneath a grin I should have recognized from our teenage years, that same expression he wore when I took the blame for every broken window, every botched science project, every minor failure our parents witnessed but never punished him for. And yet now, in this sterile office with its polished wood and artificial lighting, it all mattered more than ever, because history had a way of repeating itself if you allowed it to, and I was determined not to let him script this chapter. I remembered my morning ritual, the first sip of coffee while scanning emails, the workout that felt like a meditation in sweat, the commute with the playlist of old rock ballads that reminded me life was fleeting and small victories mattered, all these sensory anchors grounding me as he prattled on about Dad's intentions, about entitlement, about how I was just a footnote in this family's story. I let his words wash over me, outwardly calm, while internally a storm built, a slow, simmering fury that sharpened my focus instead of clouding it. And I thought about the small secret advantage I held, something hidden in plain sight, something legal and procedural, a trace of ink and signature and oversight that would, in time, become the lever to unbalance his arrogance, though I didn't yet dare reveal it to anyone but myself. My parents shifted uncomfortably, the creak of chairs and the scrape of leather punctuating their unease, and I caught a flicker of recognition in my mother's eyes, that silent acknowledgement that she knew I had carried the family on my back financially for years, yet her hands remained poised over her latte as if to keep up appearances, and I wondered aloud, sarcastically, "So this is what gratitude looks like, huh?" The faint humor in my voice earned a few awkward chuckles, not from him, of course, but from the assistants hovering at the doorway, and it reminded me of a truth I had internalized long ago. Humor is a weapon if wielded carefully, a way to remind yourself you are still human when the world insists on reducing you to shame. The symbolic Mustang key, now rubbing cold against my palm, felt heavier, more meaningful, a tactile reminder that the lineage of effort, of proof, of subtle diligence was still mine, even if temporarily obscured by his brazen claim. I thought back to trips along the Iowa backroads, him dozing in the passenger seat while I drove hours to repair something he had neglected, the radio playing faint country hits, the scent of pine and asphalt filling the cab, and it struck me how years of care and unacknowledged labor had built a quiet foundation, one that was invisible to the casual observer, but impervious to the impulsive arrogance of my brother. As the lawyer droned on, outlining Dad's supposed rationale, I allowed myself small mental digressions, rehearsing scenarios, imagining his face when confronted with procedural evidence he had overlooked, tracing every transaction, email, and notarized form that could be weaponized with precision rather than anger, because revenge, I had learned, was not about fury. It was about orchestration, a patient and calculated unveiling of truth that left no doubt and no room for rationalization. I could feel my pulse steady, a calm I hadn't felt in years, nurtured by these sensory and ritual anchors. Coffee, the scent of the office, the weight of the keychain, the rhythm of my own breathing, the faint scratch of a pen on paper, all these constants reminding me that though my brother claimed victory in loud, public terms, he had never understood the value of quiet accumulation, the patience that comes from living inside your own diligence while others chase spectacle. My mind wandered briefly, ironically, to the absurdity of life's timing. Here I was, humiliated in front of family and strangers alike, yet inside me lay a network of small, unassailable proofs, a skeleton key to undoing arrogance, and a plan forming in fragments, careful, modular, as deliberate as the coffee I sipped, as precise as the notes I kept on spreadsheets tracking mortgages, renovations, tuition, and silent bailouts. "They think they've seen the worst of me," I whispered to myself, a smirk ghosting my lips. "But patience is the cruelest kind of power, and they will learn it." The lawyer moved to the next phase, discussing the final distribution of assets, and I heard nothing but the echo of all the small betrayals, the subtle manipulations, the overlooked details that my brother had assumed were inconsequential, each one now a thread I could pull in the tapestry of his downfall. In the hum of fluorescent lights and murmurs of distant voices, I felt an almost cinematic awareness of the moment. This was both culmination and prelude, a public display of dominance he believed he owned. Yet I alone knew the unseen levers resting in my hands, the bureaucratic instruments, the tiny overlooked legal technicalities that would become the instruments of poetic justice. I let a small chuckle escape, humor cutting through tension like a blade. I guess all those years of responsible Ethan finally have their day, and I pictured the eventual reveal, the moment when his smugness would meet the unyielding clarity of procedural truth, the Mustang key glinting in the sunlight as the symbolic anchor to every act of loyalty he had dismissed, every dollar I had quietly handled, every piece of history he had thought irrelevant. The room itself seemed to shrink, the world reduced to my pulse, the key in my hand, the quiet confidence that was growing with every heartbeat as I acknowledged the irony that the very humiliation meant to diminish me had instead concentrated my resolve, sharpened my strategic eye, and tethered me to the certainty that though he had declared victory in public, the true reckoning was only beginning, and the rules of this game were mine to define, subtle, invisible, and ultimately unstoppable. I could almost see the narrative forming. Every misstep he had taken, every assumption he had made about my passivity, every laugh at my expense, all the little public moments designed to break me. They were simply preludes, overtures, to a symphony of consequences orchestrated quietly, invisibly, meticulously, with the Mustang key and the scent of coffee as the recurring motifs, reminding him and everyone else that history, diligence, and patience are debts that eventually demand payment. And so I sat there, outwardly composed, inwardly calculating, each breath a metronome to the unfolding plan, the room buzzing with the illusion of his triumph, while beneath it all a storm of procedural justice, of subtle revenge, and of long-overlooked evidence gathered like quiet ammunition, waited patiently to unspool in a way that would leave no doubt, no room for negotiation and no mercy, because some betrayals, I had learned, are too personal to forgive, and some victories are too satisfying to announce before they arrive. The office air grew almost unbearable as the lawyer shuffled papers, murmuring about clauses, codicils, and the technicalities of estate law, and I sat, unmoving, letting the words wash over me, outwardly calm, inwardly seething, every detail of the room. The polished mahogany desk, the faint scent of printer toner, the subtle hum of fluorescent lights, etched itself into my memory like a stage set for the reckoning to come, while my brother leaned back, smirk unwavering, convinced his victory was absolute, and the way he rubbed his wedding ring absent-mindedly, as if to mark ownership of everything he believed was due to him, only fueled the quiet inferno building inside me. Because he had no idea that the Mustang key in my pocket, cold and heavy against my palm, symbolized not just nostalgia, but years of meticulous documentation, overlooked emails, bank transfers, repair receipts, and notarized statements that, if revealed correctly, could unravel every smug assertion he made. And though the spectators in the room, friends, distant cousins, family acquaintances, pretended not to notice my growing tension, I could sense their curiosity, their barely suppressed fascination with the drama unfolding, as if they too were waiting to see whether I would collapse or retaliate, and that anticipation only sharpened my focus. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Ethan Porter, 38, from Des Moines, Iowa, and I've spent decades shouldering responsibilities silently, quietly, from paying off my parents' house to covering my brother's college tuition, believing loyalty was the quiet backbone of family, while my brother had spent the same decades perfecting the art of public charm, masking envy and resentment behind smiles. And now, in the sterile fluorescent light of this lawyer's office, all that training, all that preparation became visible in the almost imperceptible ways I surveyed every document, every subtle smirk, every twitch of arrogance in my brother's posture, because I knew the truth would outmaneuver him if I held patience as my shield. The lawyer's voice receded into background static as I recalled the mundane rhythms that had defined my adulthood. The smell of coffee in the early morning, the squeak of gym floors beneath my running shoes, the hum of highway traffic under the cab of my old pickup, the ritual of playlists that carried me through endless drives and deadlines, each sensory memory grounding me while the storm of betrayal threatened to unbalance my resolve. And I reminded myself that humor and irony were as potent as any weapon. He thinks he's won because he's louder. I've been quiet for years, but quiet can be deadly. My mother shifted in her seat, brushing a strand of hair from her face, her hands trembling over the teacup she barely sipped, caught between disapproval and the awkward complicity of witnessing one child belittle the other, and I felt a pang of sadness and clarity simultaneously. Family, no matter how beloved, can harbor storms of envy and favoritism, and sometimes the person you defend most is the very one who will betray you. I traced the Mustang key along the seam of my pocket, noting its weight, its cold reassurance, a tactile reminder of accumulated diligence, patience, and secret evidence, all quietly stacked in my favor, and I mused silently that the very object my brother considered sentimental was in fact a linchpin, a proof of years of financial oversight and silent labor, small yet unassailable. The lawyer paused, giving space for questions, and my brother leaned forward, smirking, projecting certainty, and I allowed myself a fraction of dark amusement as I envisioned the cascade of consequences his overconfidence would trigger: the overlooked bank statements, the email confirmations, the notarized repairs, each tiny administrative detail ready to become a decisive weapon, procedural justice waiting patiently for its moment. "You always think if you control the narrative, you control the outcome," I whispered under my breath, "but the devil and justice are in the details." My thoughts drifted to road trips we'd taken as teenagers, him snoozing in the passenger seat while I navigated with maps and playlists, the car smelling faintly of pine trees and fast food wrappers, and it occurred to me that life often mirrors these journeys. One person coasts while the other steers, unaware that their apparent advantage rests on the skill and labor of someone else. And when the time comes to shift direction, control may change hands quietly, invisibly, irreversibly. The murmurs of bystanders in the office, the clicks of pens, the scrape of chairs against the polished floor, all faded into a low hum as I mentally rehearsed the eventual reveal. The moment when my brother's laughter would be cut short by procedural inevitability, the documents, the receipts, the emails all converging into undeniable proof, the Mustang key glinting subtly as the symbolic anchor of both memory and justice, the smell of coffee punctuating the scene as an ironic sensory motif in the theater of family betrayal. Every word my brother spoke, every self-satisfied glance, every deliberate emphasis on Dad's supposed favoritism only tightened the focus of my plan, and I acknowledged, with a grim smile, that humiliation was a temporary currency, one I could endure indefinitely while weaving the threads of inevitable reversal, and that the quiet patience and attention to detail that had been my way of surviving adulthood would now serve as my instrument of vindication. I imagined the exact moment of exposure, the public unveiling where the subtle proof of my diligence, overlooked payments, documented repairs, notarized agreements, the kind of invisible labor that accumulates over years, would intersect with his arrogance, each element a note in the symphony of his undoing, and I let a small laugh escape, sardonic and private. "They all think they know the story, but they've only been reading the first paragraph." My mother's hand hovered over her cup again, the faint tremor betraying anxiety, and I recognized a deeper truth. The people who betray you often underestimate the quiet ones, those who smile, endure, and meticulously prepare, because they assume silence is weakness, when in fact it is foresight, strategy, and ultimately unassailable strength. As the lawyer continued, outlining technicalities I had long since mastered in my mental library of evidence, I felt an almost cinematic detachment, seeing the room, my brother's smugness, my parents' discomfort, as both stage and audience, aware that the narrative was about to pivot in ways no one present yet understood. And I traced the contours of the Mustang key again, letting it remind me that patience, diligence, and quiet observation were often more lethal than confrontation, that sometimes the smallest, most personal symbols could become instruments of poetic justice, and that in the orchestration of this carefully planned reveal, every sensory anchor, the coffee, the scent of leather, the hum of lights, would return to mark both betrayal and triumph. And so I sat, outwardly composed, inwardly calculating, fingers lightly brushing brass, letting each breath, each minor sound, each glance in the room feed the mental construction of a reversal so precise it would render my brother's public triumph meaningless, teaching him the hard-earned lesson I had absorbed long ago: arrogance is loud, diligence is silent, but justice, when crafted carefully, is deafening. The weeks that followed the meeting at the lawyer's office were like walking through a city in fog. Every familiar street distorted, every face slightly obscured, and I felt simultaneously untethered and hyper-aware, like a hunter circling in slow motion, observing every detail while keeping my own intentions concealed. Because I had learned the hard way that people who betray you assume you will act emotionally, impulsively. But the truth was, patience was my strongest weapon, and I now wielded it with the precision of someone who had spent decades calculating odds and consequences. And I found small, quiet ways to remind myself of control. A perfectly timed sip of coffee in the early morning that smelled like roasted beans and burnt caramel. The squeak of my gym shoes on polished wood. The hum of my car engine during midnight drives through Des Moines' empty streets. Each sensory anchor, grounding me, centering me, and giving me clarity as I mapped the forthcoming maneuvers that would turn the narrative of humiliation into a symphony of subtle, inescapable consequences. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Ethan Porter, 38, from Des Moines, Iowa, and in the quiet aftermath of betrayal, I began to notice the invisible lines that connected every moment of my life to the leverage I now held. Small threads of evidence, overlooked clauses, and the faint, almost imperceptible details in bank statements, repair invoices, and email chains, all pointing to a pattern my brother had never imagined. A web of diligence and documentation that could unravel his smug certainty with the mechanical precision of procedural justice. I started revisiting every interaction I had with him over the years. The family vacations, the shared holidays, the mundane instances where I had quietly covered for his mismanagement, and I cataloged them mentally like entries in a ledger. Each one a silent note of imbalance, each one a seed of potential revelation, because betrayal, I realized, thrives on the assumption that the victim will remain passive, that they will absorb insult without calculation. But the irony is that such patience can be cultivated into an almost unstoppable force when coupled with methodical preparation. At the office, I began digging deeper into the specifics of Dad's estate, quietly requesting copies of prior renovations, mortgage adjustments, and financial records that my brother assumed I had no access to. And each document I reviewed, each minor discrepancy I found, felt like placing another chess piece on a board where my opponent believed all pieces were his, and I smiled at the thought, dark and private, of his eventual dismay when the cascade of technicalities would come crashing down upon him. In parallel, I revisited our parents, subtly engaging in casual conversation that hinted at past contributions they had overlooked. The repairs I had funded, the financial gaps I had closed, the quiet sacrifices I had made, all while maintaining the appearance of humility and compliance, a careful balance of presence and invisibility, because in the theater of family betrayal, overreaction is the enemy, subtle influence the weapon of choice. I kept my rituals intact. Coffee each morning, the gym in the evening, weekend drives with playlists that reminded me of adolescence, of simpler times when stakes were small, mistakes were minor, and consequences could be absorbed with a shrug, and each ritual became both meditation and reinforcement, a sensory rhythm that allowed my mind to plot, to calculate, to rehearse the unveiling of what my brother believed to be invisible. Humor remained my small, private rebellion. I would mutter ironic comments about life's absurdity when reading emails from the law office, or when reviewing yet another invoice, proving my quiet labor, small chuckles that reminded me I was still human, that the gravity of betrayal did not strip me of irony, resilience, or the ability to see the comedic undertones in the arrogance of those who believe they have won. I began documenting everything with care, scanning receipts, annotating email chains, cross-referencing signatures and dates, creating a digital and physical archive that was invisible to him, but would one day speak louder than any confrontation ever could. A mosaic of diligence and overlooked detail that would expose not just his greed, but the fundamental weakness of entitlement when it is divorced from effort, foresight, and responsibility. At night, I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that steamed faintly in the dim light, tracing my fingers over the Mustang keychain as if it were a compass, mapping my route through the labyrinth of deceit and familial manipulation, while I rehearsed mental scenarios of the final reveal, my brother's confident smirk faltering, the subtle unease in the room as the factual, procedural evidence became undeniable, and the quiet satisfaction that comes not from loud revenge, but from the precision and inevitability of justice enacted through patience and careful calculation. Each encounter, each phone call, each casual meeting with family became a test, a measure of his assumptions about my passivity, and I noted the smallest tells, a flicker of impatience, a slightly sharper tone, the brief glance at a ledger he thought I ignored, all signs that he had no awareness of the archive quietly building under my control, of the invisible architecture of evidence and strategy that would soon topple his public triumph. I considered my own emotions carefully, acknowledging the sting of humiliation and the complex weave of grief, anger, and disbelief, but never allowing them to dictate my actions, because experience had taught me that uncontrolled emotion is a lever for the unworthy and a trap for the betrayed. Control, strategy, and timing are the instruments of true vindication, and in that, I found a dark serenity, a focus sharper than any momentary impulse could offer. Conversations with colleagues at work became an additional theater for my observations. I noted patterns in his professional dealings, casual remarks that betrayed arrogance, and the overconfidence of someone who assumes ethical lapses in others will never be leveraged, and I cataloged these as supplementary ammunition, knowing that every public misstep, every overlooked contract clause, every casual boast about anticipated gains would eventually feed into the orchestration of his downfall. The sensory motifs, coffee, music, the Mustang keychain, became symbols in my internal narrative, recurring cues that reinforced my connection to diligence, memory, and procedural justice, and each repetition strengthened the psychological armor I needed to endure, to plan, and to anticipate, until the inevitable unspooling of consequences would render his triumph a hollow echo. I allowed brief flashes of humor to temper the intensity, imagining him standing at the family table, triumphant yet oblivious, while the small, seemingly insignificant details I had catalogued silently orchestrated his undoing, a private joke at the expense of entitlement and arrogance, a reminder that life rewards the meticulous, the observant, the patient, often in ways the impetuous never see coming. And so, day after day, hour after hour, ritual after ritual, I built the invisible scaffolding of a quiet, unassailable reversal, aware that the world outside saw only the veneer of calm, while beneath it, a storm of procedural, meticulous, and emotionally calculated strategy was gathering strength, ready to turn every sneer, every laugh, every assumption of my brother's victory into a monument of poetic justice that was inevitable, precise, and profoundly satisfying, because some betrayals are too personal, and some lessons must be taught with the deliberate patience of someone who knows the value of every detail, every minor observation, and every overlooked fragment of truth, and in that, I found a sense of power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The thrill of knowing that the stage had been set, the players unaware, and the final act approaching with the inevitability of dawn. The days blurred into a meticulous routine, each one carefully calibrated to maintain the illusion of normalcy while I quietly expanded my arsenal of leverage. And it amazed me how easy it was for my brother to underestimate me, blinded as he was by his own arrogance, as if the very act of assuming victory could shield him from scrutiny. And in this blindness, I found both amusement and opportunity, savoring the quiet irony that patience, not anger, would be my instrument of revenge, and that the very traits he scorned in me, diligence, attention to detail, and restraint, were now the scaffolding of his inevitable undoing. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Ethan Porter, 38, from Des Moines, Iowa, and over the next few weeks, I moved like a ghost through the familiar halls of our family life, attending gatherings with a practiced smile while my mind cataloged every slight, every assumption, every casual dismissal he had ever leveled at me, and I began to notice patterns, little cracks in his facade, each one a potential point of leverage. A forgotten signature here, an overlooked invoice there, a casual boast about how he had outsmarted everyone. Each thread quietly woven into the invisible net that I was assembling, my own private theater of procedural justice. I frequented the diner in the mornings, nursing coffee that smelled of roasted beans and caramelized sugar, listening to the clatter of plates and the low hum of conversation, letting these sensory anchors soothe my mind while I plotted the movements that would one day turn my brother's public triumph into embarrassment and ruin, because revenge, I realized, was not about immediacy but orchestration. The careful alignment of facts, evidence, and timing until the moment of exposure arrived with perfect precision. Every interaction with family became a subtle chess match. A word here, a smile there, a carefully measured question that elicited just enough to feed my mental ledger of oversights, debts, and silent betrayals, and the Mustang key in my pocket became a touchstone, a reminder of continuity, history, and the quiet patience that underpinned my strategy. A tactile signal that I was still grounded in reality while orchestrating consequences that would be devastatingly real. I revisited old emails and bank statements late at night, the glow of my laptop casting a cold light over my focused face, tracing the faint lines of authorization, oversight, and neglect that my brother had assumed were irrelevant, cataloging them meticulously, annotating each one, layering them like bricks in a structure that he could never imagine being built in the shadows of his own overconfidence. Humor remained my secret relief. Small ironic mutters that punctuated long hours of review, like whispering to myself, "They think patience is weakness, but it's really the slowest kind of vengeance." A phrase I repeated like a mantra, both to steady my nerves and to reinforce the truth I had learned over decades, that people who betray you publicly often fail to recognize the quiet, meticulous work of the one they underestimate, and in that failure lies their undoing. The subtle cultural and sensory motifs of my life, coffee, gym routines, the hum of my car during solitary drives, the Mustang keychain, intertwined with my strategy, providing both comfort and a constant reminder of the life I had built, the labor I had quietly executed, and the proof that would, at the right moment, speak louder than any confrontation or argument ever could. Each day, I observed my brother carefully, noting how he assumed ownership not just of property but of narrative, how he manipulated conversations to reinforce his public triumph, how he dismissed my contributions as invisible, and in every instance, I quietly cataloged the exact legal and procedural missteps he relied upon, preparing to exploit them with surgical precision. Knowing that in bureaucracy, in documentation, and in overlooked details, the seeds of justice often hide, waiting for the patient to harvest them. I even revisited childhood photos and memorabilia, subtly inserting myself into conversations about shared history, letting my parents and extended family glimpse faint traces of my past diligence, while outwardly I smiled, nodded, and acted indifferent. Because part of this orchestration relied on my brother, never suspecting that I could or would leverage the smallest, most overlooked details into a comprehensive, unassailable argument that would ultimately destroy his assumed authority. As the tension grew, I also cultivated subtle psychological nudges. Casual mentions of prior contributions, passing remarks about attention to detail, questions that revealed he had forgotten obligations, all calibrated to rattle his composure without raising suspicion. A slow tightening of the noose through information, observation, and strategic influence. And each minor reaction he displayed fed the quiet satisfaction that my planning was working, and that every public display of arrogance would, in time, contrast starkly with the coming exposure of truth. Late nights became opportunities to refine my plan, cross-referencing legal clauses with financial documentation, noting the minutiae that would one day converge into a narrative he could neither rebut nor deny, while keeping a private humor intact, imagining his smug face confronted with irrefutable evidence that what he believed to be his triumph was actually a house of cards, each card meticulously stacked by my unseen hand. I reflected often on the lessons of life, those bitter truths earned through betrayal and hardship, and whispered to myself, patience is a currency, diligence is a weapon, and arrogance always overestimates itself, guiding my actions, sharpening my awareness, and reminding me that every slight, every laugh, every public smirk would eventually be mirrored back with the force of meticulous truth. Every social gathering, family dinner, casual visit became a dual-layered experience. Outwardly I was present, amiable, perhaps even conciliatory, while inwardly I measured, calculated, and refined, cataloging each error my brother had made, each assumption he had clung to, each public boast he had shared with friends and extended family, and mapping them against the precise bureaucratic tools, the hidden receipts, the notarized documents, and the email chains that would collectively dismantle his perceived advantage, a slow-burning crescendo of inevitability that I nurtured with ritual, observation, and quiet delight. The Mustang keychain, ever present in my pocket, became a symbolic talisman of diligence, continuity, and patient orchestration, a reminder that small, personal objects often carry the weight of history and strategy, and that the things people dismiss as trivial may one day deliver the most profound consequences. And I smiled faintly to myself, letting the private humor diffuse tension, imagining the moment when every minor, invisible piece of evidence would converge, exposing arrogance as hollow, entitlement as fragile, and betrayal as a currency easily overturned by foresight, patience, and the meticulous application of unassailable facts. And so I moved through my days, outwardly composed, inwardly vigilant, each coffee, each gym session, each drive a meditation in preparation, each family interaction a rehearsal in subtlety, knowing that the storm I nurtured in secret would one day break, precise, undeniable, and devastating, and that the arc of justice, once set in motion, would turn every sneer, every laugh, every public taunt into a monument of ironic inevitability, a quiet yet deafening lesson in what happens when arrogance meets the patient diligence of a betrayed yet determined mind. The tension that had been building for weeks now coalesced into a tight, almost tangible wire around my chest. Every encounter with my brother, every conversation with our parents, every email and casual mention of the estate, carrying double meaning and silent weight, and I moved through the days like a conductor orchestrating a symphony only I could hear, each note calculated, each pause deliberate, because I had learned that revenge, when poorly timed, is simply noise, but revenge executed with patience, precision, and a thorough understanding of human weakness can be devastatingly effective. And the image of my brother's smug grin, so certain of his victory, fueled the meticulous strategy I now employed, threading through every interaction, every observation, every subtle reminder of overlooked diligence that would someday form the backbone of his undoing. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Ethan Porter, 38, from Des Moines, Iowa, and in the quiet spaces of my life, I began mapping the architecture of accountability. Every document, every invoice, every email, every minor oversight cataloged and cross-referenced, like a digital fortress designed to withstand any feigned ignorance or public bravado my brother might deploy. And I realized that the very traits he mocked in me, patience, attention to detail, conscientiousness, were now the instruments of an inevitable reckoning, the hidden noose tightening invisibly around his assumptions of control. One spent mornings in the diner, inhaling the scent of coffee and burnt sugar, letting the sensory familiarity anchor me as I methodically cross-checked financial records against legal documents, noting discrepancies that seemed minor at first glance, but, when accumulated, formed a lattice of undeniable proof, and I allowed a quiet humor to thread through these sessions, muttering under my breath, "They always assume what they can't see doesn't exist." The irony a small comfort in the face of orchestrating a subtle yet unstoppable reversal. Afternoon drives became thinking sessions, the hum of the engine and the open road allowing me to visualize the eventual exposure, plotting how each overlooked receipt, every notarized repair, every email confirming my financial contributions would converge to dismantle his public triumph, and I imagined the exact moment when his confidence would fracture. The subtle realization dawning that every arrogant assertion he had made was built on assumptions I had quietly documented, stored, and prepared to reveal at the precise juncture. Procedural justice meeting personal vendetta in a devastating silent climax. At home, I meticulously organized my evidence, scanning documents, arranging digital files, annotating every transaction, and mapping the sequence of events that would reveal not just his greed, but his fundamental miscalculation, that he had underestimated me, underestimated my patience, my foresight, and the quiet labor I had invested in our family. A labor invisible to all, but the one willing to observe with care and persistence, and I traced the Mustang key in my pocket as a symbol, a tactile reminder that even small objects carry weight when imbued with history, diligence, and strategy, a motif that would reappear with poetic justice at the moment he realized his victory was a house of cards. Family interactions became stages for observation and subtle nudging. A question about past repairs, a casual remark about financial contributions, a pause long enough to notice hesitation or overconfidence, all cataloged mentally, each minor response another note in the composition of his eventual exposure. And I realized that the careful application of procedural knowledge, the accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant details, could exert more power than any confrontation or emotional outburst, and in that I found a combination of satisfaction and serenity, the dual knowledge that his arrogance had blinded him and that patience had armed me for precise, inevitable resolution. Humor continued to be my shield and companion, brief flashes of sardonic thought that punctuated the hours of preparation. Imagining him standing at the dining room table, smug and confident, while the quiet mechanisms of truth I had assembled invisibly reduced his triumph to absurdity, every document, every receipt, every notarized statement acting as a hammer to shatter assumptions. The very elements of life he had ignored or dismissed now returning to claim their weight, and I chuckled softly, privately, knowing that the eventual scene would be both inevitable and profoundly satisfying. Nights became rehearsal and reflection, reviewing the archive of evidence, considering every permutation of his reactions, plotting the cadence of revelation so that each moment would land with maximum impact, procedural precision, and emotional resonance. And I allowed myself to feel the thrill of inevitability, that rare, intoxicating certainty that comes when years of patience, observation, and meticulous work converge into a single, unstoppable revelation. The motifs of coffee, gym, road trips, and the Mustang key remained constant, grounding me in routine while reminding me of continuity and diligence, sensory cues that would serve as both anchors for my resolve and symbols in the eventual poetic justice, tying the seemingly mundane to the consequential, connecting small personal rituals to the orchestration of his public undoing. Every morning, every meeting, every casual encounter became another layer in the architecture of exposure, my outward composure masking a mind alive with calculation, observation, and anticipation, and I marveled at the irony that my brother, so certain of his supremacy, had left every vulnerability exposed, had assumed passivity equaled weakness, and had overlooked the quiet diligence that is the most patient, unassailable weapon of all. By the time the final week before confrontation arrived, the structure of revelation was complete, a lattice of evidence, documentation, and procedural inevitability so precise that no objection, no protestation, and no denial could withstand it, and I allowed myself a small, private smirk, imagining the exact moment when the weight of this carefully orchestrated truth would fall, a cinematic collapse of arrogance and entitlement, the coffee-scented air of the office, the glint of the Mustang key, and the culmination of decades of patient observation converging into a scene of undeniable, quiet, yet devastating justice. And so I waited, outwardly calm, inwardly electric with anticipation, tracing the contours of my secret advantage, each detail in its place, each piece of evidence ready to articulate the slow, precise, inescapable narrative that would finally overturn the public humiliation, the arrogance, and the assumed triumph. And as I sat, hands lightly on the Mustang key, sipping coffee that had become both ritual and symbol, I knew that the moment of reckoning was imminent, and that patience, diligence, and strategic observation would yield a satisfaction louder than any shout, more precise than any retaliation, and profoundly poetic in its inevitability. The morning sunlight spilled unevenly across my kitchen, cutting through the blinds in sharp lines that seemed almost like prison bars, and I felt a peculiar clarity as I sipped my coffee, the faint caramel aroma grounding me, as if the ritual itself were both a meditation and a preparation for the storm I had been building quietly for weeks, because I knew that the next phase required absolute control, not just of facts and evidence, but of timing, demeanor, and perception, every nuance of my presence in the family sphere, calibrated to tighten the invisible noose I had spent months constructing. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Ethan Porter, 38, from Des Moines, Iowa, and though outwardly the world saw a calm, mildly amused man, inwardly I was a machine of observation, measurement, and subtle influence, cataloging every interaction with my brother, every glance of my parents, every casual remark made by friends or bystanders, weaving each tiny observation into the intricate web that would transform his public triumph into a stage for poetic justice. The Mustang key still tucked securely in my pocket, weighed heavier today, more than metal and memory. It had become a tactile reminder of patience, diligence, and the quiet accumulation of proof, each scratch and worn edge, a subtle echo of long nights spent reconciling bank statements, invoices, and email confirmations that, together, formed a lattice of unassailable leverage, one that my brother could neither see nor anticipate. I had begun frequenting familiar places, the gym where I had worked out since college, the diner where Mom and Dad always expected me on weekends, the stretch of highway where I once drove with him snoozing beside me. Each location now a stage for careful psychological play, subtle planting of reminders, and observation of his reactions, small fractures in his overconfidence that would one day become decisive. Conversations with extended family were approached like interviews. Each question, Each subtle reference to shared history, each innocuous comment about maintenance or finances, carefully calibrated to elicit revealing micro-expressions, the nearly invisible slips of a man who had assumed dominance without recognizing the slow, methodical accumulation of evidence I had cultivated in plain sight. The rhythm of my days, the sensory motifs of coffee, engine hums on solitary drives, the glint of the Mustang key, became instruments of focus, structuring my attention and reminding me that the ordinary contains the extraordinary if observed with diligence, and that the very details my brother dismissed, the invoices I had quietly filed, the emails he ignored, the receipts from repairs he had assumed I forgot, would converge into the proof that would dismantle his arrogance with surgical precision. I even allowed myself moments of private humor, imagining his face when confronted with the irrefutable architecture of evidence, the procedural inevitability that would reduce his public smirks to whispers, and the quiet, cruel satisfaction of seeing entitlement meet meticulously documented reality, knowing that the more he had flaunted his assumed supremacy, the greater the impact of the eventual revelation. My parents, still unwitting players in this slow orchestration, occasionally offered glances of concern or curiosity, unaware that the calm figure before them was orchestrating a controlled reversal of the narrative, a careful choreography of proof, timing, and psychological pressure, designed not merely to humiliate but to educate, to enforce a lesson in patience, diligence, and respect that had been absent in my brother's assumptions for too long. Even work interactions became part of the tapestry. Casual mentions of prior contributions, lightly sarcastic comments on responsibility, and subtle references to overlooked obligations, all feeding the invisible ledger of observation, a ledger that would ultimately make the invisible visible and turn every assertion of dominance into a theater of procedural collapse. Because I had learned that people who betray you publicly rarely consider the quiet, cumulative impact of careful, unnoticed labor. The Mustang key, glinting faintly in sunlight as I traced it absent-mindedly, became both symbol and anchor, a reminder of continuity, of the rituals and sensory markers that had shaped my days and my strategy, and of the slow, patient buildup of leverage that now formed the backbone of my silent campaign, one designed to transform every insult, every laugh, every public declaration of victory into a stage for inevitable, carefully calibrated consequence. At night, I reviewed mental simulations, plotting sequences of revelation, mapping his expected reactions to the meticulous presentation of facts and documentation, anticipating each rebuttal, and refining the timing to perfection, because the most devastating revenge is never impulsive, but measured, surgical, and undeniable in its clarity, leaving no room for doubt, no opportunity for counter-narrative, only the quiet satisfaction of inevitability. The layers of preparation were exhausting yet exhilarating. Cross-referencing estate documents, compiling email trails, annotating invoices, and rehearsing family gatherings in my mind like scenes in a play, each gesture, each word, each reaction anticipated and accounted for, while outwardly maintaining the calm of a man who sipped coffee, smiled and nodded, masking the undercurrent of calculation that ran beneath every movement. Humor and irony remained my companions. Fleeting mutters of private amusement punctuating long hours of scrutiny, small acknowledgments that life is absurdly ironic, and that the very traits he had mocked in me, restraint, meticulousness, diligence, were now the instruments of his undoing, the silent, invisible forces that would transform his public triumph into private, inescapable reckoning. In each interaction, I noted cracks, a fleeting irritation in his voice, a momentary hesitation in his eyes, an unguarded expression betraying assumption, arrogance, or overconfidence, and each one became a thread to pull, a subtle leverage point in the architecture of his eventual exposure, while the recurring motifs of coffee, music, and the Mustang P grounded me, reminding me that the ordinary had been transformed into tools of strategy, and that every familiar smell, sound, and object would return to mark the moment of poetic justice. And so, moving through the city, the office, the gym, the diner, I became simultaneously participant and observer, the calm, seemingly unremarkable brother in public, while in private, a strategist orchestrating inevitability, every detail catalogued, every interaction leveraged, and every minor observation stored for the moment when the entire facade of arrogance, entitlement, and public triumph would collapse under the weight of meticulous preparation, procedural justice, and the patient precision of someone who had long since learned that silence and diligence are often more lethal than anger, and that the ultimate revenge is crafted in quiet, deliberate strokes, leaving the betrayer with nothing but the bitter clarity of inescapable consequence. The days blurred into a rhythm of observation and preparation, each moment calibrated with near-obsessive attention to detail, like a sniper lining up a shot that would only be revealed when every element of the environment, every distraction, and every assumption aligned perfectly, and I found a strange exhilaration in the tension. A satisfaction that came from knowing my brother's arrogance was my ally, because he could never anticipate that patience, meticulousness, and the careful collection of evidence could wield more power than any outburst or confrontation, and that the very things he had dismissed as weaknesses, restraint, quiet endurance, and attention to overlooked details were the instruments that would unravel his public supremacy. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Ethan Porter, 38, from Des Moines, Iowa, and over the past months, I had refined every interaction into an experiment, every word and gesture cataloged as potential leverage, while outwardly maintaining the persona of the calm, unassuming brother who takes things in stride, the mask that made him underestimate me, the perfect camouflage for the slow accumulation of undeniable proof that would one day invert the narrative of humiliation and entitlement. The Mustang key was a constant tactile reminder in my pocket, a symbol of continuity and personal history, and also the physical trigger that connected my memory to action. A small, unassuming object that represented every overlooked repair, every financial contribution, every notarized statement that collectively formed an unassailable chain of accountability, one my brother assumed would never see the light of day. I visited the same diner every morning, inhaling the comforting aroma of roasted coffee beans and the faint caramel undertones, letting the sensory ritual steady my mind and sharpen my focus as I meticulously reviewed scanned receipts, email threads, and bank statements, cross-referencing and annotating, creating layers of redundancy so that nothing, no technicality, no oversight, could escape scrutiny, and the thought of his eventual realization when all of these seemingly insignificant fragments would coalesce into undeniable proof was a small private thrill that I allowed to circulate through my consciousness like caffeine in the bloodstream. Every family interaction became a subtle psychological battlefield. Casual questions about past repairs, passing remarks about overlooked contributions, carefully timed references to shared history, all designed to elicit minute reactions, slight inconsistencies, or unguarded admissions, each one another thread in the web that would entangle him in his own arrogance. And I watched the smallest gestures, the twitch of a smirk, a flicker of hesitation, a tightening grip on a coffee cup, as evidence that my strategy was working, that the architecture of inevitability was taking hold even before the formal confrontation. Work and social interactions became extensions of this strategy, opportunities to observe patterns, note overconfidence, and test assumptions, and I cataloged each verbal misstep, each exaggerated boast, and each casual dismissal of responsibility, all contributing to the mental map of leverage I was building, the invisible lattice of inevitability that would, in the final act, render his triumph not just hollow but spectacularly undermined. Humor punctuated these hours of silent orchestration. Ironic mutters and sardonic quips that I spoke only to myself, a private acknowledgement that life is often absurd, and that those who assume dominance without foresight are inevitably the architects of their own undoing, a lesson I had internalized through decades of observation, responsibility, and careful navigation of both family and professional dynamics. Late at night, in the quiet of my apartment, I ran simulations in my mind, the sequence of document presentation, the precise order of revelation, the way each notarized repair invoice would punctuate his arguments, how email confirmations would strike at his assumed authority, and the timing of subtle psychological nudges to amplify impact, each element meticulously rehearsed, so that when the final act occurred, there would be no possibility of counter-argument, no loophole left unaddressed, only the quiet, unassailable clarity of procedural and personal justice converging. The Mustang key, the coffee, the rhythms of my days. These recurring motifs were anchors in a sea of calculated tension, reminders of my continuity, patience, and commitment to seeing the orchestration through to its inevitable conclusion. Each sensory detail a small reinforcement of focus and emotional control, ensuring that my reactions remained deliberate, measured, and lethal in their precision. I began to notice subtle shifts in my brother's behavior, micro-reactions to my casual comments, fleeting irritation at my presence in shared spaces, and tiny hesitations when discussing past family contributions, each one a confirmation that the invisible web I had been weaving was tightening, that his overconfidence was beginning to collide with reality, and that the convergence of documented evidence, procedural knowledge, and patient observation would soon render his triumph an artifact of arrogance rather than accomplishment. Even casual family gatherings became arenas for subtle nudges. Passing mentions of prior contributions, pointedly innocuous questions, and the careful calibration of tone and timing, all designed to provoke micro-reactions that would later reinforce the narrative of his miscalculations. While outwardly, I maintained a smile, nodded, and remained the unassuming brother, the embodiment of patience and composure, the perfect camouflage for the storm quietly brewing beneath the surface. The orchestration of revenge, I realized, was not only a matter of documents and receipts, but also of perception, timing, and emotional leverage, and every passing day of calm, every ritual of coffee and music, every glint of the Mustang key, became instruments in the symphony of inevitable exposure, quietly preparing the stage for the crescendo where arrogance, entitlement, and public triumph would collide with meticulous evidence and procedural inevitability. And so I continued, outwardly serene, inwardly electric with anticipation, mapping each variable, cataloging each micro-expression, rehearsing each sequence, allowing humor and irony to punctuate the tension, and knowing that the patience, precision, and attention to detail that had guided my adult life were now weapons, silent yet devastating, poised to dismantle the facade of superiority my brother had built on assumptions, negligence, and unearned confidence, leaving him exposed to the full, undeniable weight of justice delivered with meticulous, inevitable precision. The winter evenings in Des Moines had a way of sharpening your awareness, the cold biting through layers of clothing and carrying a clarity that only came with frozen streets and quiet nights, and I used that clarity to trace every line of my plan, every sequence of exposure, every procedural step that would turn the world my brother thought he controlled into a theater of revelation. Because revenge, I understood, is not simply about emotion or retribution, but about precision, timing, and the orchestration of overlooked details that accumulate into an unstoppable force. And as I sipped coffee at the diner, letting the caramel scent mingle with the low hum of conversation, I felt the weight of inevitability settle into my chest, calm and resolute. The Mustang key in my pocket, a tactile reminder of both history and leverage, an anchor in the storm of strategy I had cultivated. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Ethan Porter, 38, from Des Moines, Iowa, and I had spent months moving quietly through the lives of my family, observing, cataloging, and calculating, turning every casual remark, every laugh, every public display of arrogance into data points, each one another brick in the foundation of a revelation that would be both undeniable and devastating, because my brother had assumed that passivity equaled weakness, that restraint meant submission, and that diligence and patience were trivial. But in that very assumption lay the power I now wielded. Each document, each notarized repair invoice, each overlooked email confirmation became part of a lattice of evidence that I had been building meticulously, and I imagined the precise moment when their convergence would hit him. The arc of inevitability, procedural justice intersecting with personal reckoning, the quiet orchestration finally visible to all, the very public stage upon which arrogance would meet consequence. And every sensory anchor I had maintained, coffee, the hum of my car, the Mustang key, would mark the arrival of truth in a way both symbolic and profoundly satisfying. Family dinners, work interactions, casual conversations. Every encounter was a rehearsal, a test of assumptions, a subtle probe to measure his overconfidence and my own readiness, and the faintest reactions, a flicker of impatience, a micro-expression of doubt, confirmed that the unseen threads I had woven were tightening, that the stage for exposure was nearly set, and that the crescendo of inevitability was imminent, quiet but deafening in its impact. Humor threaded through these hours as always, small ironic observations muttered under my breath, a private acknowledgement that life has a cruel rhythm, and that those who believe victory is theirs by default rarely consider the patient accumulation of diligence and foresight, the quiet acts of observation and preparation that can, when timed perfectly, render arrogance and entitlement meaningless. And I let myself smile at the thought of him standing at the lawyer's office, smug and triumphant, only to realize in slow, cruel increments that the proof I had accumulated would dismantle every claim he had made. Nights became simulations, sequences of revelation played repeatedly in my mind, every possible reaction mapped, every loophole closed, every procedural technicality leveraged, because the most effective revenge is precise, unassailable, and inevitable. And I understood that the more he had flaunted his assumptions, the more spectacular the eventual collapse would appear. A quiet theater of justice orchestrated with patience and attention to detail, and grounded in the sensory realities of my everyday life. The Mustang key, glinting faintly under the diner lights, was both symbol and anchor, connecting memory, evidence, and strategy, a tactile cue that the ordinary can become extraordinary when observed, recorded, and deployed with purpose. And I let its weight remind me that subtle symbols often carry consequences far beyond their apparent significance, especially when entwined with human error, oversight, and arrogance. Procedural justice had become my silent weapon. The overlooked signatures, the mismatched invoices, the notarized confirmations, all small technicalities my brother had ignored, now assembled into a lattice of inevitability that no amount of charm manipulation or assumed superiority could overcome, and I let myself feel a deep satisfaction at the quiet symmetry of it. The poetic irony that the very details he dismissed would be the instruments of his undoing. I reflected on the philosophies I had cultivated through years of navigating both professional and familial betrayal, muttering to myself lines that had become almost mantras. Arrogance is loud, diligence is silent, but patience is deafening, and they always assume the quiet endure because they are weak. But endurance is preparation, and preparation is power, and each phrase reinforced my resolve, sharpened my focus, and reminded me that the smallest unnoticed acts can become the most decisive instruments of consequence. As the final days approached, I tightened the orchestration, reviewing documents, rechecking cross-references, ensuring that every sequence of revelation would hit with maximum clarity and minimal ambiguity, every micro-expression accounted for, every assumed advantage neutralized. And I allowed myself private moments of amusement, imagining the staggered realization on my brother's face as his public triumph crumbled under the weight of meticulously documented truth. The sensory motifs I had cultivated, the coffee, the engine hums on late-night drives, the Mustang key's cold weight, became intertwined with the narrative of revelation, each detail returning to mark both memory and consequence, grounding me in the ordinary while facilitating the extraordinary until the day of confrontation approached with cinematic inevitability. And so I moved through the final week outwardly composed, inwardly electric, rehearsing sequences, anticipating reactions, cataloging every minor variable, and letting the quiet humor of the universe, the irony of arrogance undone by diligence, of entitlement undone by unnoticed labor, sustain me. Knowing that the ultimate reckoning would not only deliver justice, but also provide the poetic closure of a narrative meticulously constructed from years of observation, patience, and strategic mastery, and that when it arrived, every element, every smell, every glint of the Mustang key would converge to expose betrayal, entitlement, and arrogance in the most satisfying, precise, and unforgettable manner imaginable. The morning of reckoning arrived quietly, with a low sun casting long shadows across the lawyer's office, and as I stepped into the familiar lobby, the scent of brewed coffee mingled with the faint antiseptic tang of paperwork, grounding me in the sensory reality I had cultivated over months of preparation, reminding me that every detail, every document, every receipt, every notation was now aligned, waiting for the moment to speak louder than any confrontation could, because I understood that the power of revenge lies not in volume, but in precision, timing, and the inevitability of exposure. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Ethan Porter, 38 from Des Moines, Iowa, and as I adjusted my coat and traced the familiar grooves of the Mustang key in my pocket, a private ritual that had become a symbol of my patience and diligence, I felt the electric thrill of inevitability ripple through me, knowing that every small, unnoticed act of observation and preparation had converged to this moment, the apex of months of quiet orchestration. The office smelled faintly of polished wood and ink, and as my brother stepped in, all confidence and swagger, I felt the familiar mix of irritation and amusement at his arrogance, the same smug certainty that had fueled my months of meticulous preparation, and I realized how easily he assumed victory simply because he had shouted louder, smiled wider, and cultivated an air of entitlement that blinded him to the subtle accumulation of evidence I had gathered. The procedural arsenal I had assembled was formidable. Notarized repair invoices, meticulously cross-referenced emails, bank statements tracing funds he had assumed were invisible, all layered into a narrative so airtight that no denial, no charm, no manipulation could circumvent it, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that these mundane documents, overlooked and underestimated by him, would now become instruments of his undoing, the mechanical yet poetic wheels of justice finally grinding into motion. Family members began to arrive, their eyes darting between us, sensing the tension, the invisible undercurrent, and I smiled faintly, privately amused by the dramatic irony that they had witnessed years of assumed superiority, and now would see the careful reversal unfold with the inevitability of procedural perfection. The coffee I sipped was hot, the familiar caramel undertones a small comfort, and I let it anchor my focus, each sip a meditation on timing, each exhale a release of controlled tension, because I knew that the public humiliation he had once directed at me would now return to him in a quiet, devastatingly precise form. I began presenting evidence in a calm, methodical fashion, the documents tracing every financial contribution I had made to maintain the family estate, every repair he had neglected or assumed I would overlook, every notarized confirmation of my diligence, and as I walked him through the chain of accountability, I noticed the subtle shift in his expression, confusion, disbelief, and then the first flicker of panic, the tiny cracks in his composure that months of careful observation had predicted, and I felt the thrill of inevitability pulse through me. Humor and irony threaded silently through my thoughts as I imagined the scene from his perspective, the smug face, the assumed dominance, slowly unraveling under the weight of meticulous proof, the same arrogance that had once allowed him to mock me now, leaving him exposed, every smirk mirrored back as disbelief, and I smiled faintly, savoring the quiet justice of procedural precision meeting personal vindication. The recurring motifs, coffee, the Mustang key, the subtle notes of music in my mind, became instruments of clarity and control, reinforcing the sensory anchors that had guided me through months of patient orchestration, and I realized that these small, seemingly mundane details would now mark the culmination of my strategy, the sensory punctuation to a narrative of betrayal, patience, and precise revenge. My parents watched, their expressions a mixture of astonishment, pride, and regret, as I calmly outlined every overlooked contribution, every silent sacrifice, every minor detail he had assumed was irrelevant, and I allowed myself a private note of satisfaction, knowing that their recognition would amplify the impact, that the social and emotional layers of exposure would compound the procedural collapse I had engineered. Each piece of evidence I revealed was met with small, imperceptible reactions, a twitch of an eyebrow, a tightening of the jaw, a shift in posture, all of which confirmed that my anticipation had been correct, that the lattice of preparation, observation, and meticulous documentation had rendered his defenses impotent, and that the architecture of inevitability was now fully operational, turning months of patience into a crescendo of undeniable reality. I reminded myself of the philosophies that had guided me. Patience is a currency, observation a weapon, and diligence a force that arrogance can never anticipate. And people assume what they cannot see is irrelevant, but invisibility is the perfect camouflage for inevitability. And I felt a quiet thrill knowing that these truths were now being enacted in real time, with a clarity and impact that emotion alone could never achieve. The symbolic Mustang key in my pocket, the caramel aroma of the coffee, the hum of life in the office, all converged as sensory markers of control, evidence, and timing, underscoring the culmination of my orchestration, and I knew that the public humiliation he had once inflicted upon me would now return in a form so precise, so inevitable, and so quietly devastating that it would resonate far beyond the confines of the room. A lesson in arrogance, oversight, and the meticulous power of patience, observation, and procedural justice. And in that realization, I felt a surge of satisfaction that was equal parts vindication, relief, and the quiet thrill of a strategy executed flawlessly. The room felt charged, a low hum of tension vibrating between the walls as my brother's confidence began to falter, tiny micro-expressions betraying the first flickers of panic that I had been anticipating for weeks, and I allowed myself a private, ironic smile, knowing that the careful lattice of evidence, documentation, and procedural inevitability I had constructed was finally asserting its presence in a way that no amount of arrogance or charm could counteract. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Ethan Porter, 38, from Des Moines, Iowa, and in this moment, I realized that patience, observation, and meticulous preparation were more powerful than any confrontational outburst, because the slow accumulation of truth carries a weight that arrogance can never anticipate, and the quiet, almost imperceptible unraveling of his assumed supremacy was the purest form of justice I could imagine. As I methodically laid out each document, each notarized repair invoice, each scanned email confirming financial contributions he had ignored or assumed invisible, I saw the subtle shift in the dynamics of the room. Our parents leaning forward, extended family exchanging glances, his smug grin slowly melting into confusion, disbelief, and finally a twitch of panic. The precise reactions I had rehearsed in my mind for months, and I felt the thrill of inevitability pulse through me like electricity. Humor threaded through my thoughts, quiet and sardonic, imagining his internal monologue. How could this be? I controlled everything, while in reality, he had controlled nothing but assumption, entitlement, and a public facade that was now being methodically dismantled by procedural precision, patience, and the quiet labor of observation that he had dismissed as trivial. The coffee on the table steamed faintly, the Mustang key in my pocket cold and reassuring, tactile symbols of continuity, diligence, and the slow orchestration of justice, small, ordinary objects that had come to carry extraordinary significance, reminding me that the ordinary, when observed and deployed with intention, can become the instruments of revelation, and that every sensory detail cultivated over months, every drive, every gym session, every diner coffee, was now participating in the ultimate exposure of arrogance and betrayal. I guided him through the timeline, pointing to emails, invoices, and notarized statements, each one a silent hammer striking at the edifice of entitlement he had built, and as he fumbled for explanations, sputtered denials, and attempted to assert control, the cracks widened, and I felt the private satisfaction of watching inevitability unfold without emotion, the quiet, controlled orchestration of cause and effect leaving no space for charm, manipulation, or excuse, only the clarity of unassailable truth. Procedural justice revealed itself in the overlooked technicalities, misfiled documents, overlooked signatures, and mismatched approvals that he had assumed were meaningless, now became pillars in the structure that crushed his claims, and I could see the dawning recognition in his eyes that every assumption he had made about my passivity had been a fatal miscalculation, a lesson in arrogance meeting meticulous observation. Humor again surfaced internally, ironic and private. He had mocked me publicly for patience and diligence, and now those very qualities were systematically dismantling the narrative he had built on ignorance, entitlement, and overconfidence, and I let the irony wash over me, sweet and quiet, a personal celebration of strategy, restraint, and timing. I allowed him to flounder, every question answered with calm, measured precision, every rebuttal anticipated and neutralized. Procedural and emotional leverage interwove him into a rhythm so controlled that he could only stumble forward, helpless, while family members absorbed the full picture, the lattice of evidence so clear that denial was impossible, and the social and emotional weight amplified the impact, turning arrogance into spectacle, entitlement into embarrassment, and public triumph into undeniable collapse. The Mustang key, the coffee aroma, the hum of the office, and even the subtle lighting became part of the tableau, reinforcing sensory anchors I had cultivated to maintain focus and clarity, symbols that would later mark the moment of poetic justice, connecting the ordinary to the extraordinary, the mundane to the consequential, and every detail to the orchestration of inevitability. My parents' eyes reflected pride, recognition, and a hint of regret, witnessing what I had quietly engineered for months. The convergence of patience, observation, and procedural diligence manifest in a revelation that left no ambiguity, and I felt the satisfaction of not just personal vindication, but the broader resonance of justice enacted with precision, clarity, and inevitability. The lines I had rehearsed in my own mind whispered like mantras. Patience is a currency, arrogance never understands, diligence is a weapon, and observation is the guide to inevitable truth. And each phrase underscored the calm, yet devastating rhythm of exposure, the quiet, almost cinematic unfolding of consequences long nurtured in the shadows, and I allowed myself to savor the final, subtle crescendo of control, precision, and poetic justice as my brother's public triumph crumbled under the weight of the meticulous narrative I had crafted with unwavering focus, patience, and foresight, every sensory detail, every moment of quiet observation culminating in the inescapable, undeniable revelation of truth. The room fell into a tense, almost electric silence as I placed the final document on the table. The glint of the Mustang key in my pocket catching the overhead light, a small tactile reminder of patience, diligence, and history converging. And I watched my brother's eyes widen in a mix of disbelief, panic, and dawning comprehension. The smirk he had worn for years finally cracking under the weight of meticulously documented truth. Because every assumption he had made about my passivity, every laugh at my diligence, every public declaration of superiority, was now collapsing with surgical precision, procedural inevitability, and a quiet, devastating elegance that left him exposed and utterly powerless. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Ethan Porter, 38, from Des Moines, Iowa, and in this moment, I felt the culmination of months of preparation, observation, and patient orchestration crystallize into something almost cinematic. The ordinary objects of my life, coffee cups, the Mustang key, my well-worn gym bag, now symbols of meticulous strategy, continuity, and ultimate revelation. Their presence a subtle but potent reminder that the smallest unnoticed details can carry the greatest consequences. My parents leaned forward, astonishment and pride mingling in their expressions, and I allowed a small, private smile, knowing that the lattice of evidence, notarized repair invoices, bank statements, email confirmations, and overlooked receipts, was not only demolishing his false claims but also transforming every ounce of arrogance he had displayed into a stage for quiet, unassailable justice. The irony almost palpable, as the very qualities he had mocked, patience, diligence, and attention to detail, became the instruments of his undoing. He stammered, searching for explanations, trying to assert control, and I let him flounder, knowing that procedural precision leaves no room for charm, manipulation, or denial. Every technicality he had overlooked, every assumption he had made, was now leveraged against him, and the effect was compounded by the silent, almost imperceptible reactions of our family. The extended network of observers who had once watched him dominate and now bore witness to the collapse of entitlement under the weight of quiet, methodical truth. Then came the first twist. As he realized the full scope of the exposure, I revealed a hidden layer he had never anticipated. A digital trail connecting him to manipulations he had attempted to conceal, emails he had deleted, but that had been quietly archived, contracts he had assumed were void, but that contained clauses meticulously prepared by me, each piece an additional hammer striking his fragile sense of invincibility. And the second twist hit when he discovered that a key piece of his assumed leverage, the family's long-neglected will and property agreements, had been legally amended months prior by a lawyer I had consulted discreetly, ensuring that all the assets he thought belonged to him were now fully accounted for, legally inaccessible, and irrevocably aligned with the narrative I had constructed. A move so elegant in its subtlety that it left him not only powerless, but completely blindsided. The Mustang key, now resting on the table, became the symbolic center of the room. Once a token of shared memories, it now marked the pivot point of reckoning, a tangible connection between ordinary routine and extraordinary consequence, and I allowed myself to let the moment stretch, savoring the quiet poetry of justice, delivered with precision, patience, and inevitability. My brother's face was pale, his arrogance replaced by shock, fear, and the dawning comprehension of total loss. And the silence of the room was broken only by my calm, deliberate voice, summarizing the chain of accountability, the technicalities he had ignored, and the personal diligence he had underestimated. Each word a measured instrument amplifying the psychological weight of exposure, while the sensory anchors of coffee aroma and Mustang key glint reinforced the moment's gravity. I offered him no mercy, only clarity, a combination of emotional and procedural precision that left no room for dispute, and I could see the bitter taste of reality settle on him like frost, realizing that every laugh, every public humiliation he had delivered, every assumption of dominance, had been inverted with quiet mastery, patience, and strategic insight. Humor threaded faintly through my consciousness, the same ironic amusement I have carried through months of preparation, because in the theater of arrogance undone, there is a subtle, almost sacred joy, a reminder that human oversight and hubris are often the architects of their own collapse, and that the very traits mocked in the meek, diligent, and patient are the ones that can deliver the most profound impact when wielded deliberately. In the end, as the family looked on, my brother's public triumph transformed into a tableau of quiet humiliation and legal defeat, a dual lesson in arrogance and oversight, while I stood calm, holding the Mustang key, sipping coffee, and reflecting on the philosophies that had carried me here. Patience is louder than rage, diligence more lethal than arrogance, and observation the truest instrument of justice, and they will always mock what they fail to understand, that the quiet endure, and endurance is preparation. And as I stepped away from the table, leaving him to face the consequences of his own assumptions and entitlement, I felt the rare, exquisite mixture of satisfaction, closure, and wisdom, knowing that the betrayal had been undone not with anger, but with meticulous strategy, precise timing, and the quiet, inevitable force of truth, and that in this orchestration of poetic justice, the ordinary rituals of life, coffee, music, a car key, patient observation, had become the instruments of a deeply personal, unforgettable reckoning, leaving him with nothing but the stark clarity of defeat and me with a sense of hard-earned, resonant victory that would echo far beyond the room. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.